So I guess I'm just going to jump right in so I can hopefully make up some of the lost time. My name is Scott Keating. I am the Senior Product Designer at Side Effects Software, and I'm going to be talking about Houdini to Unreal workflow tips and tricks. So this was actually created based on an internal VR project that we were working on that basically made me realize a couple of things that were really useful that a lot of people don't know about in the Houdini to Unreal workflow, especially with Houdini Engine in particular. So let's just jump right in. So just in case you're not familiar with what Houdini can do and what Houdini Engine allows you to do with Unreal, we'll just take a look at this very simple asset here. So we've got this, basically this asset that packages up all these materials and shaders, as well as this sort of interactive tool for creating these old cabin looking things. You can see that we have this sort of fairly basic interface on the right hand side for changing things like the width or the height of the roof or the placement of the door. And so these are the types of things you can build in Houdini, these procedural geometry creation assets, things that we call Houdini digital assets. And so the idea is that you can take something like this that is basically a complete tool, including things like textures and handles and an interface, and basically take it outside of Houdini and bring it into some other application like Unreal. So here is the same HDA, that's the file format HDA, and here we are obviously in the Unreal Engine. And we just drag this digital asset into the content browser, and then it becomes essentially a tool inside of Unreal that you can just directly use. So you can see basically just drag the asset just like you would basically any object in Unreal into the viewport. You'll see some cooking. This is actually recorded on my surface over here, so it actually takes longer to cook than it actually does to cook, but you can see the result is the same. You pull across all the materials, we pull across the interface. If you look down at the bottom right, you can see the width, the roof peak, and the door placement. You can see that I can still interact with the handles just like I could in Houdini. So basically you've encapsulated that whole tool, that whole workflow that somebody has built, and then you've brought it into the Unreal editor in exactly the same state. And so Houdini Engine is basically a way of building tools outside of Unreal that work inside of Unreal. And just for interest, it also works in Unity and Maya as well. But Houdini, of course, is a huge package. It's a visual effects package, it's an animation package, it's a rendering package, it's a full content creation package. So there's a lot of very convenient tools in there that would be probably possible to build in Unreal, but very sort of unwieldy to do it or difficult. Whereas Houdini is meant to be a 2D or an artist's tool. Figure out which button to press. That's walk through the process here of how we can take something like these materials and how we get them across. Like what actually is the process of getting them across? Because it looks fairly automatic, and it is essentially automatic, but there are some things you need to do, and they have some pluses and minuses. So I think I'm playing the same video again. Let me just make sure here. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so essentially in order to assign materials, in Houdini we use this node called the material node, and it does pretty much what you would expect. You pick parts of your model. In this case, I'm picking the beams, and then I'm assigning the beams shader to it, and you see it shows up in the viewport. And under the hood, if you know how Houdini works, what's essentially happening here is that we're generating these things called attributes. And attributes are essentially like little pieces of data that get attached to geometry, in this case, primitives specifically. And so under the hood, these associations we're making here are actually generated as basically a string that says assign this material to this group of primitives. That's what's happening. And that's nice because it's very convenient. It wraps it all up. And then the Houdini digital asset itself can actually bundle all of the files that you're using here, all these texture maps, inside this node here. You can see this old cabin node into our digital asset and actually embed the files inside of it. So this isn't just the tool set, it actually has all of the files here, all these normal maps and texture maps, all basically stuffed inside of it. And that's good because it means you have one file, but really you have a whole bunch of files. And the way this material assignment happens when you go to Unreal is essentially something very basic, which is that we look at our standard Houdini principled shader, and we have these things called tags, these OpenGL tags, and we try to match them up with the base physical shader in Unreal, because most physically based shaders have very similar or exactly the same parameters, roughness, metallicity, and so on. Which is nice because it just comes right across. What you see in Houdini more or less is what you see in Unreal. So let me show how that works again. So again, we're just going to bring over this asset. We're going to drop it in our content browser, drag that into the viewport, and it's going to cook and do some things to get this stuff into Unreal. You can see it's compiling the shaders, and what that actually means is a couple of things, but essentially it's doing this analysis that I just mentioned. It's checking to see, okay, what parameters are on your Houdini tool and what ones can match up with something in Unreal. And what you get is basically a bunch of Unreal materials that are automatically generated for you, as well as extracting all of the texture maps and putting them inside your content browser here, right, so that they all work. So the materials are being driven completely by Unreal. They're just being sort of sourced from this Houdini Engine asset. And again, this is in some ways a really good thing because whatever you do in Houdini, you're going to see the result in Unreal. But what we found, or at least what I found when I was working on this particular project, is that it became a little unwieldy to always repackage this asset when maybe all I wanted to do was change one texture map or something like that. And it was actually much easier to just import it into Unreal than it was to put it inside the asset. And that just has to do with like iterations, right? You want to tweak even just something small about the texture map, and you just want to quickly see it in the engine. You don't want to have to do this import, export process every time. And so what's nice is there actually is a way to, instead of having this Houdini Engine transfer of everything, to basically build shaders in Unreal, but have the engine assign a specific shader, any shader that you like. So just as an example here, if this is going to play, here again is that same asset. And we go to the materials folder. I basically have just recreated those materials myself inside of Unreal. So these haven't been transferred over from an asset. This is just a typical standard Unreal shader with, in this case, just a normal map, roughness, and albedo or diffuse map. And that's it. So I've just rebuilt them myself using standard Unreal tools. So how do I tell now instead? I don't want to use the materials from my asset. I don't want to use those materials. I want you to assign a specific material inside of the Unreal Engine. So again, Houdini has this idea of attributes, like I was saying, which basically lets you put these tags on things. So I've just disabled that material node now, so there are no material assignments at all. I'm going to use a node called attribute create. And then we have these special references to Unreal things. So in this case, it's something called Unreal Material. It's literally just named Unreal Material. I can change the attribute type to a string and basically just paste in the reference that I got from Unreal, which is just basically the path to that material in the Unreal Engine. And that's it. So instead of applying material in Houdini, instead I'm saying, once this is in Unreal, go find game/materials/planks and use that as the material instead. And so here now back in the Unreal editor, you'll see now if I drag over, at first I re-import it because obviously I saved my underlying asset. Then I drag it into the viewport. And you'll see that a couple of things are slightly different. You don't see this big step of compiling all the shaders because there are no shaders assigned to the asset anymore. Instead, my imagination or that stuff? Okay, sorry. So you see that it does cook, but now it's assigned the material the same way that material node did it. But now Unreal itself is actually doing this assignment. So that that shader lives entirely on Unreal. And if we go and look in that temp folder now, you'll see that it has not copied over any of those other shaders. It hasn't generated anything. It's just directly using the shader that I referenced in that attribute create. And so now this is really nice because I can work kind of two ways. I can create a sort of a unified block if I know for sure it's going to work, or I can use an Unreal shader and let that do the work. And so just to sort of finish that thought off, obviously now I just would go back and go ahead and create all of the material. So this is sort of like a cooking network thing. Like, I've already done this. Here it is. It's great. We have all our nodes. We've set all our materials just like we set with the material SOP. You can see that we're just setting this string directly. So I'll go ahead and save it, go back over to Unreal. Go to my HDA and re-import it because obviously I saved it. And then we can use this nice option that's called rebuild all instances. And basically any of the assets that you've dragged in your scene will get updated. And in this case, the materials will all get assigned. So in some sense, like, well, okay, it's kind of cool that you can do this, but like, what's the actual benefit of this? I mean, the result is exactly the same cabin, right? It has the same textures. It looks the same. So the benefit is that in Houdini, you can create really complicated materials, right? We have a physically based renderer and a shading language, and you can write materials that are very, very complicated that there's absolutely no way to represent in Unreal directly. And vice versa. Unreal has a really nice shading language. It can do really cool things that you want to take advantage of, right? And so if all you're doing is transferring these basic parameters across, you're sort of losing a lot of the power that Unreal has to work in a real-time context, right? So, sorry. Yeah. I think this is repeating the last video. Yeah, no. So imagine I wanted to do something like create a mask on my geometry, right? So like typically in Unreal, if you wanted to change a texture map, make it look dirty, blend between two texture maps or something, you could just paint right on it, right? You could use the Unreal tools to paint a vertex color right on your mesh. Well, we can do the same thing in Houdini in this procedural manner using something that we call an attribute VOP. So all I've done here is I've created this color, this black and white color on my mesh inside this asset. And it's literally just creating this sort of noise pattern on the surface of my geometry. And so if I had a mantra shader, a Houdini shader that could take this and do something interesting with it, that would be great, but there's no way it would come across to Unreal because it would have no way of interpreting those two things. But because I can tell Unreal to assign a shader I've told it to, I can sort of know in advance what it needs. So I'm going to just go ahead and do a very simple edit to my planks shader once I re-import my geometry or my asset. And obviously you don't actually have to re-import that every time. It's just because I keep saving new versions of it. And once that's re-imported, I can now edit a shader to pick up that vertex color, right? So something that you would typically do anyway in Unreal, except now I'm driving the color from outside of Unreal in this Houdini asset. And it actually is cooking. When I captured this, the cooking stuff went off the bottom of the screen. So that's why it looks like it's not doing anything right now, I hope. Yeah. So there we go. We've got our guy. It's been re-imported. I can still edit it just like I did before. I can grab this handle, pull it out, get a different looking view of my little old cabin here. So let's edit this shader now inside Unreal. So again, no connection whatsoever to Houdini anymore. Where this is just a blueprint, a material blueprint. I'm going to do a very, very simple edit to this just to prove the point. Basically, I'm going to take this this plank texture, this wooden texture, and replace it with a older, dirtier looking piece of wood. And then basically blend between those two maps using a linear interpolation node driven by that vertex color that I created in the engine. And so this starts to become a powerful kind of workflow, right? Because you can have a tool that can do all these different things, change attributes sort of in a lot of different ways, but still have your Unreal tools pick up that data and work with it. And if you've ever built your own shader in Unreal, you'll probably do a much better job of what I'm doing here. But the point is, I'm just taking a piece of the vertex color, in this case the red channel, and I'm using that to blend between the sort of clean wood texture and the dirty wood texture. And again, we need to save our material in Unreal to have it apply. And once again, it was recorded on my Surface there, so it's much faster if you actually are doing this on a workstation or something. But here you go. You can see the result now. If we zoom in, you can see the dirty planks, the sort of greenish ones at the bottom, exactly where those black and white maps were matching up. And so now we have an Unreal shader driven by a Houdini attribute on Houdini generated geometry that's sort of live. And so now you've created this really good workflow, right, where you don't have to keep jumping back and forth and changing materials and changing assignments. Everything is driven by the tool, but you can still use all the tools that you have in Unreal to create something really awesome. And so to take that even further, something that you often want to do is multiply something by a color. That's a typical way of adding variation to a shader in Unreal. Like you've got a bunch of blocks, you've got a bunch of rocks or something. You want some of them to be brown and some of them to be gray and maybe some of them to be blue. So you can create something called a parameter in the blueprint that lets you have something that you can change on your shader, right? So instead of just this black box as it exists right now, we can put in a color, and in this case I'm just doing a very basic multiply on our texture map, and I'm going to set the default color to like a purplish, bluish kind of a color. So again, typically what you would do now in Unreal is that you would create something called a material instance, right? And that allows you to have the same material, but with different parameters for different objects, right? Which again is really powerful. It's a great thing that you can do in Unreal. But if we're coming straight from Houdini Engine, there's no real way to do that, right? Because as I mentioned, we just do a straight conversion across. But you can actually use more of these attributes to do really interesting things in Unreal. So here we go. We've got our purple cabin now. Let's jump back over to Houdini. We'll dive inside the exact same place. And basically, we're just going to do more or less the same thing. We're going to create a new attribute. We're going to this time call it, instead of Unreal Material, we're going to call it Unreal Material Instance. And we're just going to give it the same path to that material that we used before. And unlike just making an assignment, which is what happened last time, it will see that, well, this material already exists. You're asking me for an instance of it. And so I'm going to create a material instance as soon as that asset cooks inside of Unreal. So once again, we'll just save this node, jump back into Unreal. I'm just once again just going to recook this asset. And once this is recooked now, it's going to do something pretty cool. Every time this object, a new version of this object is created, it's also going to create its own material instance to pair with it. And that way, if I want to have a purple cabin and I want to have a different color cabin, I can actually go right ahead and do that, again, driving it by the attributes rather than having to go by hand, create the material instance, and edit the shader that way. So okay, here we go. We've got our purple cabin. Let's just drag out another version of our cabin. So here's the material instance, by the way, that was created. So we'll just drag out a second cabin, drop it in there. It's going to do the same thing. It's going to cook. It's going to assign the material, and then it's going to generate a second material instance just for this cabin. In just a second. And so again, what we're doing is just using the tool set that's most powerful on both sides of this divide, right? Taking advantage of everything Unreal has while still taking advantage of all the tools that you can build easily inside of Houdini. So here you can see now we have two instances of that material. I'm just going to move this out of the way so you can see the burn updating as I change the color. You can see me awkwardly trying to click on that button because I made the window too small, but we'll turn it on. And now you can see immediately as I start changing the color, the burn starts changing color. So again, this really nice workflow of using all of the stuff that Unreal has that's really awesome, and just using it directly inside Unreal on a Houdini digital asset, but without the sort of tedious work of having to create the copy, assign it to the object. Every time you create one of these things, all of that is handled for you by the Houdini Engine plugin for Unreal. And then the last thing I just want to talk about is that this isn't just materials. There are many of these properties. In fact, almost all of the Unreal properties you can modify this way. So for instance, you can see that this whole time there's been this sort of green sphere and this red sphere on the handles. But if I go into play mode, they disappear. And typically in Unreal, this is handled using a Unreal property that says is hidden in game, I think. Hidden in game. Yeah, actor hidden in game, and there's a checkbox, but you can see that the checkbox is not enabled here. And the reason that it's not enabled is that I could drive that by an attribute the same way. So back in Houdini, what I actually have already done is created an attribute inside this green sphere or this red sphere. Exactly the same way I created the material parameter, except this one is called Unreal uProperty hidden in game. So this naming convention works for pretty much any Unreal property. So you can turn on two-sided, you can turn on and off is hidden in game, and you can have the asset do that for you. So again, you're sort of offloading some of that work on the Unreal side to Houdini Engine, but getting the benefit in Unreal directly. So these are sort of just like little workflow tips that I've came across as I was building my own project using this this cabin asset. I found it really makes me have to iterate less because I can build a tool and just know it's going to assign directly exactly what I want. So I can stay in the editor longer without having to sort of jump back and forth. If you haven't checked out Houdini before, definitely go and check out our game dev tools. You can find them on our website, sideeffects.com. Where we have a whole bunch of tools directly dedicated to doing effects and all kinds of really awesome assets that you can use in Unreal and in Houdini directly. Probably going to have a speaker up just next that's going to show a bunch of cool stuff that you can do. So I hope this was interesting to you. Once again, my name is Scott Keating. I am a senior product designer at Side Effects, and thank you very much.